Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Security Repo podcast. One of the difficult things about being in security, particularly if you're in the weeds, is understanding what's happening at a holistic view. Everything happens so quickly. There's new acronyms, there's new tools, and there's new definitions. It's hard to keep track of it all and understand it, but luckily, there are people like our guest today, Rachel Steffens, who understand security and developer tools on a holistic level. They understand the industry and the trends that we're going towards. These magical people are called Analyst. Rachel is coming to provide the analyst view of what's happening in security, and particularly what we can expect with the latest trends in shifting left or bringing security into the developer world. So Rachel is a senior analyst with RedMonk. Now, RedMonk is a developer-focused industry analyst firm, and RedMonk focuses on how practitioners drive technological adoption. Her research covers a broad range of developer and infrastructure products, with a particular focus on engineering and growth technologies and markets. Rachel, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you here.
That was a super kind introduction, and I appreciate it. Sorry I gave you such a tongue twister there at the end. I think what I would love to highlight there is that I'm not specifically someone who focuses on the security space. Like, I'm not a security analyst. I'm more kind of that holistic SDLC of like, what does it take to get code instantiated, written through the pipeline and into production. And so security obviously plays a big role in that. And so that's kind of my view, is like, I'm not going to come in here and tell you all of the grand security things, but more that holistic view of how is security being a crucial puzzle piece and how all of this comes together. So hopefully that'll be a good conversation.
I think it's really important, and that particular things is why we're excited to have you here, is because security is moving into different spaces, right? We're trying to break up the security silo, and it's entering into the developer space. But developers struggle with it, security practitioners struggle with it, and so trying to help understand it from a holistic point of view, from the whole software development lifecycle, is really important. So we're thrilled to have you here and bring that perspective.
Yeah, literally one of my first questions I had when we met, it was like, so an analyst for all of software? That seems like a
A lot.
boiling ocean, way too big a chunk. How do you go about it? Like, is there a section of the SLC you care about more than others? Just love to hear a little bit more about what the analyst role does from your seat.
So that's a great question, one that I ask myself every day when I get on. Because one of the things that's really hard about this is that when you kind of do this breadth versus depth thing, and then I'll talk to experts and all of these different companies who are doing these amazingly complicated and smart things, and it's constant imposter syndrome because everyone is technically going to be deeper than me in just about everything. I have a background in databases, data and analytics, things like that. So that's an area where I tend to feel more comfortable. But I look at the entire SDLC, and the reason I look at the entire SDLC is because it's all interconnected. It's a team sport. So the way that RedMonk kind of views the world is from that practitioner lens. It came out of the view, kind of early open source, early cloud, where our founders kind of realized that the tools that practitioners were using and choosing to use to build their applications were not necessarily the same ones, that the people who were like the buying power CIO on the golf course didn't necessarily understand what was happening in like the rank and file in terms of how things were getting built. It was really kind of novel 2006-ish. I think a lot of people have come around to the view of developers and the people who have their hands on the keyboards have a lot more power and a lot more say in terms of what tools are getting used. So that's kind of how we view our world, but it's also one of those things where you can't solely focus just on that developer persona, because we care about the entire pipeline of how that code gets in. So we can't just care about how it gets written. We have to care about everything.
Well, it has to give you a really, not unique perspective, but holistic perspective of what's going on. We talk to a lot of people, and there's this term that keeps floating around, and we publish it in our stuff too. We've embraced it, the shift left, or shifting left. Um, so we see that as like, hey, developers use these tools earlier in the process, and that's kind of how we've interpreted it inside of GitGuardian, and then I think in general in the DevOps space. But from your perspective, what has that meant? What is shifting left? What is that accomplishing, or is it accomplishing anything?
Yeah, so I think it's a tool that in some areas is embraced, and some areas is maybe embraced as a necessary evil. In some areas, people are starting to bristle against it because it's asking a lot of people. And so I think shift left applies to a lot of things, not just security. I mean, it's kind of started with testing. We've seen it shift left in terms of architecture and design. We're seeing it in terms of security. Like, we're seeing it in a lot of things. And the overarching goal in all of these things is like, can we have concerns that maybe would have arisen further down in the SDLC process come to the surface sooner so that we can fix it sooner, which is a great thing for everybody involved in theory, because the developers are not wasting their time on rework. We can get things done faster. It's less cost, that especially if it's like a bug in production, it's much better to fix it sooner rather than once it's actually running. So all of those things are great things in theory. In practice, where we start to see the pushback from everyone involved is, are the tools actually supporting the developer's ability to do this in a way that's not cumbersome? And is it fitting into the developer workflow? And I think that can be a really mixed bag for a lot of teams and a lot of tools.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's people often, developers and security folks or other people often want different things. For example, like one of the developers' core focuses is speed. Can I get something done efficiently? And one of the security folks' core focus is, can I not miss something? Can I make sure that I'm capturing everything so that I've got all my data that I can run through? Those two things are in direct conflict when you try and force a developer to use a security tool, right? Because they're looking at different things.
Well, I mean, yes and no, because I feel like your security team is all about, like, if you're asking a developer to fix a 0-day, like, the security team is also very much about, like, how fast can we push this patch? Like, so I think it feels like it's something that can feel like it's in conflict, but it's also one of those things where over and over again we're seeing, like, the DORA report, where it's like the stability metrics and the throughput metrics are things that support one another in an organization that is kind of working at a top level. But I think a lot of the times when we're still trying to get that culture of the security mindset that's spread throughout the organization, it can feel like they're conflicting things, because it's just changing your perspective of how these teams are working together, and it's changing the perspective of trying to have shared values and shared metrics.
Yeah, well, speaking of working well together, do you have any examples of where you think shift left has worked well, like where it's being successfully implemented in particular areas?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's the way that we're building code these days is it's not how it used to be, where someone's going to sit at a keyboard and they're going to type out an entire application, and this application is entirely constructed by hand. A lot of the ways that we are building applications now is going to be components, either open source components, or we're going to be pulling in third party data or APIs, things like that. And so one of the things that I think is great about how we're trying to shift left and have these things do it is, like, thinking about how all these components are coming together earlier. So can we look at our dependency vulnerabilities? Can we look at how our APIs are constructed? Things like that, where we can catch that sooner than if it were just running and we're like, oh gosh, like, we just got popped. And so I think where we can think about things, I think one of the things that is important is thinking about those dependency vulnerabilities, and can we think about how all of these components are starting to come together earlier than when we've actually have the entire application running in production. I think that's great. I think our industry will forever be talking about the log4j issue in terms of, and until we have some other big vulnerability come up that supplants it. But I think in terms of things like that, it's like, what are my open source components? How did these all come together? And what makes sense? That said, like, shift left isn't going to cover all of the vulnerabilities that are, there's still going to be runtime vulnerabilities. There's still going to be credential stuffing. There's still going to be kind of business logic things that are going to happen in prod. So you can't shift everything left. You still have to have that runtime component. But the earlier we can catch some of the things means that you can shift your focus in your production to kind of catching some of those other things, hopefully.
It's one of those interesting things with the term shift left. I think we just assume we know what that means because we have this idea of a software deployment pipeline or delivery pipeline in our heads. It starts here and it ends here, and then you recycle these things, then you get the infinite loop of DevOps. but where are we shifting to? Like, what's the ultimate left we should be shifting? Like, when you tell someone this idea in the first place, and they're like, "What do you mean left?" Like,
And I think that's one of the things that is a devil is in the details kind of thing. Because I feel like a lot of the security vendors have embraced shift left in name. At least we're like, hey, I have a VS Code plugin, and look at this. I am now part of the developer workflow. And whether or not that's something that actually makes sense for the developer in terms of are your alerts actually tuned in a way that is useful for the developer? Is there context? Can these feedback loops be short enough that the developer can use them in a way that they can actually address things in the moment? So it's in theory, it's getting something to the developer, yes, but it's not just I have now stuck something in the IDE. It is it contextual? Is it useful? Is it something that the developer can actually make actionable? And so I think that's a big part of it. And not all of the tools have necessarily done that.
I have a follow on to that too. I think we tend to think of application development as this is a part of the business that's under IT or information, the CIO or CTO, whoever it sits under. But what about the entire other realm of application, quote unquote? Like with Zapier, I can tie together HubSpot with 15 other applications and create workflows. And by definition, that's an application. It does a thing when I put an input, it spits out an output for me, or it causes a chain of things to happen. Is that part of this conversation at all in the wider sense from your seat? Do you see it out there?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. And I think that's really, like, honestly, probably not enough of that is considered as part of it. So I think one of the things that we think a lot of the time is our applications are going to run through this pipeline, and it is going to be a defined process of getting something from code to prod. But as you say, like, there's a lot of different versions of what actually constitutes an app, and is something where it's purely constructed out of APIs, something that's going to flow through that pipeline, or is it something that kind of is a side channel? And so I think a lot of people do not have that standardized deployment process in place in such a way that they probably also don't have standardized security checks in place around it.
Something you said too, which is it's really interesting that I want to, I just want to kind of bring up again is you mentioned like that a lot of security tools like have the IDE plugin, but it doesn't quite work, and I feel like this is one of the problems where we could take these security tools and we kind of give developers a way to use them, but it just doesn't fit in with the workflow. It's just not, it's in their system, but it's just not kind of helpful. With that in mind, what are some of the challenges that we're kind of seeing in trying to get this shift left movement happen? Like where are we falling off? We can all agree we want to get the early alert, we want to get the alerts early, we want to get the alerts that developers can fix to the developers, but where are we failing in our in us or the vendors or the applicator? Where are we failing in shifting left?
Yeah, so I think one of the things about shift left is inherently saying, here's a security tool, and I want to push it over into the developer realm. And there's a lot of challenges to that because the security tools are inherently designed for what was previously a totally different buyer, like the security team, the CISOs, CTOs, things like that, versus a developer team who maybe has very different concerns or different priorities in terms of what they want from a tool. And the feedback loops are like long scan times that maybe are okay in a security world. There's something that would absolutely not fly for a developer. There's a lot of different ways that a developer expects to interact with a security tool. And so I think a lot of the tools that are traditional, quote unquote, security tools are the ones that are trying to shift left into that developer space. But there's also an alternative motion where we're seeing the tools that have a developers in mind first. And kind of so we have the runtime security over here that is trying to shift left, but we also have the developer focused security tools that is trying to shift into the runtime. And we see both of that happening at once, where we have some tools shifting left, we see some tools shifting right. And I think a lot of the times it's easier for some of these like application focused tools to shift into that runtime mode rather than having a traditional security tool be able to understand and appreciate all the nuances of what it is that a developer values in a security tool. And so I think it's one of those things is that we're seeing cross motions in the market right now.
So up to now, you mentioned it just there, like not just shifting left, but shifting right, which hasn't entered the conversation until just now. Um, what would that mean? Like if shifting left is getting the developers to embrace this stuff earlier, what's the shift right? Getting the security team to run development tools? Like,
I think it's one of the things that we're seeing in the market right now is an expanded kind of collapse of categories. I think is a good way to forget. So like what we used to see as previous point solutions start to take on adjacencies over and over. So something that was previously doing like composition analysis starts doing like static scanning, and then you start to look at infrastructure as code, and it kind of these tools start. And so like Sneak's a perfect example here, where they're starting to have a bigger portfolio of things that are doing things. And then you had Sneak Cloud kind of come in and are like, okay, can we start to look at these things in terms of like also what's happening in runtime, things like that. So I think one of the things that you see is not necessarily that you want security teams to adopt developer tooling, although that's also something that happens, but it's also like these tools are expanding in their breadth in terms of what it is that they're doing. And I think when we start to talk about market trends, we start to see this broadening of what it is. So point solutions start to expand into things that start to look more like a security platform.
maybe boil up a level from like the CISO or the higher level perspective. Like, what what are they doing internally? Like, is this a conversation CISOs are having? Is like, we got to shift left, we got to shift right, or is this like something we're observing from the outside and is not part of the internal security conversation in companies?
As Mackenzie was talking about earlier, it's like the security team is like, I don't want to miss anything. So I think a lot of that CISO conversation is what is my risk posture and how can I address that? And what tools do I have available to do that? And then you start to think about how does this all come together? And so some of it is going to be we need specific point tools to catch specific risks that we see based off of how our organization runs, based off of what we already had in place, because everybody is not operating from a greenfield. I can just pick the best in time tools. I have to kind of work around what I already have and the investments that our organization has already made. And then you start to figure out how do these all come together? Who needs the information from the tools? How can we surface the information most effectively? And how can we have everybody collaborate in a way that's meaningful? So that like the high level is how can we all help each other do our jobs better? In terms of shifting left or right, it's really going to depend on what tools do I already have in place and who needs the information. So it's kind of just going to, the standard analyst answer, I apologize, but it's going to be it depends.
No, I as someone who said that, I don't know how many conversations in the last couple of years of my life, I 100% respect that answer. But I think that answers it really well. Like, what's the overall goal? To be secure. Can we ever be 100% secure? No. How do we get to the least amount of risk? That's the conversation. So, however you get there, left, right, up, down, A, B, select, start. Like, I think that's where we're at with it.
And I love, so there's some of the other phrases that I've seen besides shift left. So it's like shift everywhere security, which I think is everybody is in charge, which is maybe less helpful, but it's one of those things. The other one, there was an engineer at Google who was calling it smear left. So like the security still resides with the security team, but we're just going to kind of spread it out amongst the entire SDLC. I liked that term. I've definitely had some people give me feedback about really having a visceral reaction to the word smear. So, you know, take it or leave it.
100% me. I'm not going to lie.
I think the goal is like, we want to make the entire organization more security focused, and we have to figure out how we can do that.
Yeah. Another one that I really liked was on an episode with Isabel Monet, and she said it's shift left, but a lot of people make it shove left, meaning like we're now shoving all this responsibility onto the developers. I really liked that one. But
that's a big part about how to make this a successful thing is you can't just hand over the responsibility to your dev teams without handing over the tooling to go with it. We can't just keep throwing more and more on our developers' plates. We have to have ways for these to be automated. We have to have ways that this fits into their workflow. We have to have ways that this kind of integrates in a way that is more seamless for them. Because if it becomes a shove left, then we have when we talked about like what is the pushback that you're getting, like some of that pushback is you're asking me to do more and you're not giving me the resources with which to do it.
I'm briefly interrupting this episode to talk about the Security Repo's sponsor, GitGuardian. GitGuardian is a code security platform that specializes in detecting secrets in your development workflows and also in your code repositories. Not only can GitGuardian bring to the surface all of those leaked secrets from way back in the history in your projects, but it can also let you know when systems have been breached by using their brand new Honey Token module. Honey tokens are fake credentials that you can put in your environments and also in your third-party tools to know when they've been compromised. GitGuardian is free for all teams with less than 25 developers. You can sign up today at gitguardian.com. All right, back to the episode.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned on there, we were talking about successfully moving left. So the next question, the obvious question is, okay, how do we shift left? Like, what if you're an organization and your security teams are siloed, you're catching security vulnerabilities in production instead of beforehand. Like, how can you shift left? What do you do? What's step 1 and what's step 4 in this process?
So if I were doing step 1, it would probably not actually even be a security focused step 1, but my step 1 would probably be, does your organization have baseline DORA metrics in place in terms of how you're thinking about stability and throughput, and what does it take your teams right now to push code? How stable are you? What does it take to recover when you do have an incident? Like, do you have that baseline in place? Because that's going to be a really important part of how you're measuring this shift left process. Because like we said, when you're starting to move things over to your development team and if you start to get that pushback of like, you are now putting the onus of security on me, and now I'm having longer scan times, I'm having a harder time getting things into prod, you have to be able to measure like what is the actual change that is happening. And is that stability and velocity offset something that makes sense? Because it might be something where you have shoved like this long scan onto a development team and this feedback loop is not working for them. And so, but you can't know that if you don't have measurements. So I think step 1 is, can you have a baseline measurement? And then can you start to, as you shift, measure how it changes and impacts your teams? Step 2 then is, if you do start to see some of those feedback loops be long, like what can you do to shorten them? And so like some of the things that you can do is like, okay, like this is like a particularly egregious, like long running scan. Can I throw more compute resources? It's like, can I think about this holistically in terms of how am I measuring things? Like, where am I going to have the prioritization in terms of just like, this is the most important pipeline. This is like our trunk pipeline. So we really want to focus there, versus like, this is a scan that runs all the time. So like, let's throw more on that. It's like, think about like, what is it in terms of both kind of quality and quantity in terms of like, where do I need to throw my resources to make this something that works well for my development team so that I can have that faster feedback loop for them? How do I fit into their workflows? How is it something? And then the other thing that I think is interesting is, where does the security team make a difference? So like, there's going to be times when like, because I think one of the complaints that we get is developers say, I'm not a security expert. I don't want to be a security expert. So part of it is, what can I focus in context to make it so that it's easy for developers? Where do I need my security teams to help prioritize things? And then where does my security team need to get out of the way? So like, part of that is like, if your security team's primary job is just like making tickets for developers or like pushing alerts to the developer, like where can some of that start to just go straight to the developer and kind of take a step out of there? But in order for that to happen, I would say then step 3 is like, have you thought about tuning all of your alerts. Because if you are drowning your developers in false positives, that is the quickest way for your developers to absolutely burn out on being in charge of security. So like, have you thought about how things are tuned? Have you put in the work to actually kind of suppress some of those false positives or correlate events so that things all go together? And have you tuned your tooling so that you're dealing with that? So that's kind of where I would say it's like, are you measuring? Are you fitting into your developer workflow? And are you tuning out false positives so that your developers are getting high signal to noise?
Measuring what matters is like, there's a book called that. There's that's one of the trickiest things I think we face in all of IT, in all of computer science, is how do we measure success? And I was going to make a point earlier, and I think you just answered it, I think, through there. Uh, if a developer comes up and says, "Hey, this ain't working for me. This is interrupting my workflow, and I am not happy," I don't think that's conversations happening. I think it's just, "Hey, I'm going to go do this other ticket because it's easier," or I'll just skip around that or end around that. I'll just skip my hooks and we'll be fine. Just hope for the best, and they'll never find out. Uh, but
Security is from some random person on the internet. His name was Avi Douglas, but it was security at the expense of usability comes at the expense of security. And I think that is such a crucial quote to think about as you're thinking about shifting. It's like, if you want your developer teams to be doing the most secure development, you need to make it as easy as possible for your developers to be doing the right things.
I love that. I'm going to remember that quote. That's a fantastic
security at the expense of usability comes at the expense of security. Like, if you want to remember one thing from this podcast, I think that's the key one.
It's, and it's something that we see so much too, is that when something becomes hard, I have some strong opinions about things that I guess it's in conflict to the traditional security line. And one of them is kind of like, when I talk a lot about managing secrets in source code. And one of them is like, what's the best secrets manager that we could possibly use? And there's some really great ones in there, but sometimes they're not going to be the best for you. Sometimes it's better to use something much more simple, because developers are really clever. And when they don't like to do something, they figure out a way around it. And so if it doesn't fit into the life cycle, then it just doesn't work, and it won't work. And that's when you end up with, security at the expense of security, because the usability isn't there. That's a great one. We're coming to the end of this episode here, and we like to play a game with our guests called Best and Worst. And we're going to ask, what is the best advice that you could give someone for security? Or perhaps it might be the best advice that you've heard. And then also, what is the worst advice that you've been given, or you've heard someone given, or maybe the worst advice that you have given to someone? Let's start with the best, though. What's the best advice that you would give?
The thing that comes to mind is one of my favorite stories. It's not necessarily advice, but it's my most favorite corporate America IT security flaw I've ever encountered. So it was just decades ago. I am setting up some kind of internal password, and you set up your password, and then you have to have your security questions. And the security question that this IT team had picked as one of the options, and it's still just it's my most favorite terrible question. But the question is, what month is it? So if you're asking your user to I can't remember what my password is, but I'm going to remember what month I set my password. Like, what on earth is this? As a general, it's like, I think it remains one of my very most favorite moments of like, who the fuck came up with this? But like, also jokes on me, because it's like, this is the worst security question ever. But like, I don't remember what the software is. I obviously don't remember what my password is, but like, for the rest of my life, I will remember that I set that password in June, because it was just such an atrociously bad question that I'm like, oh, I guess this is just like seared into my mind forever. So like, it's both bad and good all at once.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That was like the best advice is to make it usable. The worst advice is do that. I think that is quite funny.
I guess my good advice is like, if you're gonna make it bad, make it so bad that it's ridiculously bad so that people remember. I
That's nice.
That is nice. Well, look, we've come to the end of the episode here. I just want to give a shout out to RedMonk. Can you give a quick shout out as to what RedMonk does, and maybe some of the content or that might be interesting for people to follow that RedMonk creates?
Yeah, so if you go to our website, redmonk.com, my colleagues and I post a whole bunch of research and just kind of thoughts about what's happening in the industry overall. We have a lot of research about, coming up soon, we'll have one about like what programming languages are we seeing traction with and kind of things like that. So lots of things that are quantitative, lots of things that are just qualitative. What are we seeing in the market? And it's lots of fun, and it's all available without a paywall. So redmonk.com.
And there'll be links into the show notes as well. So Rachel, thanks so much for coming on the show. And if you happen to enjoy this episode and you want to hear more about Rachel, then stay tuned, because next week we have another episode with Rachel. So we'll be excited to see you again there. But until then, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Dwayne, any final words before we click the big red button?
I just want to say thanks very much for coming on. And yeah, measuring it is kind of the secret of improving anything. And I'm never going to forget when I set my passwords ever again.
Never ever.